He boarded the plane like any other elderly passenger, quiet, polite, and invisible to most. But by the time the wheels touched down, the very people who dismissed him would be scrambling to save their careers, their reputations, and maybe even their freedom. No one asked his name. No one cared to look twice. Not when his skin was dark, his coat was worn, and his gait was slow. They saw what they wanted to see: a tired old black man who didn't belong in first class. They spoke over him, laughed behind him, and humiliated him in front of a cabin full of strangers. But what they didn't know was that every step they took to strip him of dignity was taking them one step closer to the worst mistake of their lives. This isn't just a story about cruelty. It's a story about power, about truth, and about what happens when the world finally sees what it tried so hard to ignore. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you witnessed this? And if you believe that respect should never be based on appearance, hit that like button and subscribe. We have stories that will shake you. Arthur Langston moved through the boarding tunnel with deliberate care, the steady tap of his cane echoing off the steel walls as a sea of passengers swept past him without notice. His shoulders, draped in a slightly faded overcoat, were rounded not just by age, but by the invisible weight of decades lived in a world that rarely offered him the benefit of the doubt. Clutched in his hand was a first-class boarding pass, Seat 1A, marked clearly in bold letters, pristine and legitimate. The ticket hadn't been gifted or mistakenly issued. He had purchased it weeks ago, directly through the airline's business concierge, as he always did when traveling for major quarterly board evaluations. The difference this time was nobody knew who he was, and that, as it turned out, would make all the difference. As he approached the aircraft entrance, a woman in a navy and gold uniform stepped forward. Kylie, the lead flight attendant, stood with her clipboard angled just enough to suggest authority. Her smile was tight, almost strained, as her eyes scanned the slow-moving figure before her. She didn't greet him. She didn't offer to help with his carry-on. She simply blinked, unimpressed, and waited for him to hand over the boarding pass. When Arthur did, she barely glanced at it before frowning, the kind of frown that was too practiced to be confused, too quick to be justified. "Sir," she said, her tone a blend of caution and condescension, "this area is reserved for our first-class passengers." Arthur looked down at his ticket, then back up at her, his voice soft but firm. "It is. Seat 1A." Kylie's lips tightened. She scanned the barcode, and the system beeped in affirmative. Still, she hesitated. "Are you sure this isn't some kind of error? It's just. We have protocols for upgrades, and sometimes people are issued seats that don't reflect their booking class." Arthur didn't flinch. "No upgrade. Booked directly. Weeks ago." She hesitated again, then motioned him past her with the same energy one might use to wave away a street flyer, polite but dismissive. Arthur entered the cabin and found his seat at the very front. He lowered himself into the leather chair with measured control, placed his cane beside him, and folded his hands. He didn't look around. He didn't gawk or speak. He simply sat, as he always had, prepared for the flight ahead. The first-class section was beginning to fill, a mix of tired executives, honeymooners, and tech entrepreneurs too young to hide their egos. Nobody acknowledged him. That wasn't unusual. But Kylie wasn't done. Moments later, she reappeared, hovering near his seat with an air of false cheer. "I'm sorry, sir, I need to verify something again," she said, gesturing for him to hand over his ticket once more. Arthur complied without resistance. She stared at it longer this time, as if trying to will the barcode to admit it was wrong. Then, without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward the cockpit. Arthur's brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. He had the patience of a man who had waited through far worse storms. Several minutes passed. Other passengers began to glance over, murmuring among themselves as they sipped champagne and adjusted reclining seats. Then Kylie returned, flanked this time by a male flight attendant named Derek, his uniform crisp, his posture taut with trained neutrality. "Sir," Derek began, his tone attempting warmth but edged with formality, "I'm going to kindly ask you to move to the main cabin while we sort out a reservation discrepancy." Arthur blinked. Discrepancy. There seems to be an issue with the system. Just until it's clarified, Derek added, already reaching for Arthur's carry-on beneath the seat. Arthur's voice dropped, firm now. You're asking me to vacate my seat for a ticket that's scanned properly and hasn't been challenged by any other passenger? Kylie stepped in. It's standard protocol, sir. When there's uncertainty, we seat the most high-priority guests first and resolve conflicts after takeoff. And how often, Arthur said slowly, does this protocol involve removing an elderly black man without even reviewing your manifest first? The question hung in the air like smoke. Neither attendant answered. Kylie's jaw tensed, and Derek looked away. Still, they didn't back down. I'm afraid you'll need to comply, Kylie repeated, louder this time, her eyes darting toward the cockpit as if summoning backup. We won't ask again. By now, the nearby passengers were watching more openly. One woman with platinum earrings leaned toward her husband and whispered something. A young man across the aisle paused his podcast and pulled out his phone. Arthur stared up at Kylie, the corners of his mouth tightening. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. If you truly believe I don't belong in this seat, I'll wait until someone with authority can tell me that directly. Kylie's face turned red, but before she could respond, a voice from behind interrupted. Excuse me, it said, calm but unmistakably firm. Everyone turned. A woman mid-30s, standing just a few rows back, had stepped forward. Her blazer was immaculately tailored, her tone crisp. I saw him board. I saw his ticket. And I've flown enough to know how this works. Kylie blinked. Ma'am, this doesn't concern. It does now, the woman interrupted. Because I'm also a first-class passenger. And what I'm seeing is discrimination masquerading as procedure. There was a murmur from behind her. Another passenger stood, an older man with a shock of white hair, his voice low. She's right. Kylie turned toward Derek, her face now pale. Arthur remained seated, still silent, but the slight nod of his head, barely perceptible, told them everything they needed to know. The tides had just shifted. The moment the young woman stood up to defend Arthur, the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin turned electric, a fragile charge suspended between confrontation and collapse. Kylie's lips tightened into a thin, brittle smile, but her tone lost all pretense of professionalism as she stepped forward, raising her voice just enough for surrounding passengers to hear. This gentleman has failed to present valid credentials for this seat, she announced, ignoring the fact that Arthur's boarding pass had been scanned and confirmed. Her words sliced through the murmuring crowd like a blade. Arthur didn't react. He sat quietly, eyes forward, face unreadable, the same stillness he had used his whole life to withstand storms. We're not trying to make a scene, Kylie continued, glancing around as if gathering support from the very people beginning to look at her with suspicion. But we cannot allow anyone to remain in first class without proper verification. I have every right to escalate this. She turned to Derek. Escort him to economy, she ordered flatly, as if removing a misplaced suitcase. Derek hesitated, his eyes flicking to Arthur, then to the gathering stares of passengers now craning their necks, recording with their eyes, even if not yet with their phones. Kylie, maybe we should wait. Now, she snapped, and without another word, she reached down and grabbed Arthur's carry-on bag herself, yanking it from beneath the seat. Ma'am, Arthur said quietly, you're out of line. Sir, she countered, you're out of place. That was the last straw. The woman who had defended Arthur earlier stepped forward again, phone now visibly recording. This is unacceptable. He already showed you his pass. You're dragging him out of first class without cause. Do you realize how this looks? Kylie's head whipped around. Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to stop recording. That violates airline policy. It violates human decency, the woman said, unmoved. And I think the internet would be very interested in seeing what airline policy looks like today. If you don't put that phone away, Kylie said, her voice cold and clipped, you will be removed from this flight immediately. Her threat hung like smoke. The woman stared at her, then slowly stopped recording and lowered her phone, but not before shooting Arthur an apologetic look. Kylie turned back, now emboldened by her false authority. Mr. Langston, please stand. You will be reseated in economy. If you refuse, I will call airport security, and they will remove you before we leave the gate." Slowly, with the weight of every insult endured over a lifetime bearing down on his shoulders, Arthur reached for his cane and rose from the seat. His face remained composed, but his jaw was clenched so tight it seemed carved from stone. Around him, some passengers watched in silence, others with discomfort or thinly veiled disdain. The man in 2C smirked and muttered, "Should have known he didn't belong here," loud enough for Arthur to hear. Kylie turned to lead the way, motioning for Derek to follow, and the three of them began a slow procession down the aisle. Arthur walked without resistance, but each step felt like a wound reopening. His back, once straight with quiet pride, now bowed slightly, not from submission, but from years of carrying the world's prejudice on his spine. He passed rows of indifferent faces, the occasional sympathetic glance, and a teenage boy with wireless earbuds who whispered to his sister, "That's messed up." When they reached the curtain separating first class from economy, Kylie stopped abruptly and pointed toward a middle seat in the last row. "Right there," she said, without looking at him, already turning to leave. "That's the only one we have left." Arthur moved to the row, glanced at the seat, narrow, upright, already stained with old coffee, and slowly sat down. Derek lingered for a moment, eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Sir, I'm sorry," he mumbled, then turned and left. Arthur sat in silence. No pillow, no champagne, no welcome. Only the low hum of the ventilation system and the whispered judgment of passengers trying not to look at him too long. 10 minutes passed before the aircraft doors were sealed and the plane began to taxi. In first class, Kylie smiled and poured sparkling water for the man now occupying 1A, a silver-haired executive who chuckled as she filled his glass. "Thank you for sorting that out," he said. "Nothing ruins a good flight like a stowaway." She laughed softly. "We do our best to maintain standards, sir." Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, Arthur sat unmoving, his cane wedged awkwardly against the seat in front of him, his knees pressed against the tray table, his breath slow and measured. He stared out the tiny oval window, watching the terminal disappear behind them. There was no rage in his expression, only stillness. But beneath the surface, a storm was building. The kind of storm that doesn't scream. It calculates. Across the aisle, a young woman in business attire leaned toward him. "Sir," she whispered gently, "I saw what happened. I just want you to know. It's not right." Arthur nodded once, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth had already taken root, quietly, invisibly. Like all real reckonings, it had begun without warning. Kylie returned. This time, she brought another flight attendant with her, Derek again, now visibly uncomfortable but still obedient. Kylie's smile was gone, replaced by that steely efficiency reserved for situations she deemed beneath her patience. "Mr. Langston," she said, loud enough for several rows to hear, "we need to perform a random safety inspection." Arthur raised an eyebrow slightly. "Random. Standard procedure," she replied briskly. "We received a report about a potential item of concern in your carry-on." Arthur met her gaze. "And who made that report?" Kylie didn't answer. She simply held out her hand. "Please hand over your bag." Slowly, Arthur reached down and pulled the modest black duffel from beneath the seat. It had seen years of travel, but was neatly kept, organized, unthreatening. He placed it on his lap, but didn't release it. "What are you looking for?" he asked calmly. Kylie took a step closer. "Sir, failure to comply may result in federal involvement." "I won't ask again." With a breath that came from somewhere deeper than frustration, Arthur handed her the bag. She unzipped it right there, in full view of nearby passengers, her gloved fingers rifling through his personal belongings with no regard for dignity. She pulled out a folded sweater, a sealed bag of almonds, a book titled Legacy and Leadership, and a leather folder full of printed documents. Nothing illegal, nothing unusual, nothing even mildly suspicious. Still, she took her time, examining each item like she expected something to leap out and justify her intrusion. Arthur said nothing, even as she pulled out his wallet and opened it, flipping through his ID and credit cards. "Sir," she said, frowning at the identification, This doesn't list your occupation." "It doesn't have to," Arthur replied. "That's a debit card." Kylie paused, then placed the wallet back in the bag with far less care than she had taken removing it. She zipped the bag closed and handed it to Derek, who held it awkwardly, as if unsure what to do next. "No prohibited items," Kylie announced to no one in particular, as if trying to justify the scene. "However, for continued safety reasons, we're going to relocate your seat again." Arthur blinked slowly. "I'm already in the last row." "There's an alternate seat," she said, her lips curling just enough to betray her intent. "One that ensures minimal disruption to the other passengers." Before Arthur could object, she turned and led the way 2 rows down, past even the last numbered seat, to a cramped auxiliary seat near the lavatory door, one that cabin crew typically used during turbulence. It wasn't listed on the manifest as a passenger seat. The cushion was thin, cracked to the edges, and the seat belt was broken, tucked hastily beneath the frame. "Here you go," she said sweetly. "Please remain here for the duration of the flight." Arthur looked at the seat, then at Kylie. "There's no working belt." "That's been noted," she replied. "We'll advise you to remain still during turbulence." She walked away before he could say another word. Derek lingered for a moment, staring at the seat as if seeing it for the first time. He opened his mouth, but when Kylie turned and called his name, he turned quickly and followed. Arthur sat again, now nearly wedged between the lavatory wall and a metal service cabinet. The nearby vent sputtered lukewarm air against the side of his face, and every time the bathroom door opened, the stale smell worsened. Passengers walking to the restroom paused, did double takes, and shuffled awkwardly past him, some with sympathy, others with quiet amusement. He had officially been erased from the cabin's visible hierarchy, no longer a guest, barely even human in the eyes of the system that claimed to serve him. The woman from earlier hadn't forgotten, though. From 5 rows up, she turned and caught his eye, mouthing the words, "I'm so sorry," before lifting her phone again. This time, she didn't record the crew, she typed. Whatever she was writing, she was sending it somewhere. Arthur appreciated the gesture, but he didn't count on rescue. He never had. 10 minutes later, Kylie reappeared, holding a small bottle of water and a prepackaged snack. She didn't offer them. She dropped them onto the tray above his head with a thud. "There," she said curtly. "Happy now?" Arthur looked at the crushed granola bar and the dented plastic bottle, then back at her. "Do you treat all your guests this way?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She turned on her heel and left again. Behind her, 2 teenagers whispered to each other in the next row, one nudging the other and muttering something about crazy old man. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. He had flown across oceans, spoken in boardrooms filled with suits who wouldn't last a day in his shoes. He had built companies, funded charities, mentored generations. But today, none of that mattered. He hadn't eaten the crushed granola bar Kylie had thrown at him. The dented water bottle remained untouched on the tray, beads of condensation dripping like seconds lost to injustice. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. But the ache in his back deepened, and the pressure in his chest threatened to rise. He needed water, real water. He pressed the call button gently, not expecting much, not even a gesture of courtesy, but simply a drop of decency. A few minutes passed before Kylie arrived, her heels clacking louder than usual, each step a reminder of her control over this space. She didn't speak immediately. She glanced at the call light above his head, then at Arthur himself, then finally allowed a sigh to escape her lips, as if she'd just been asked to clean the lavatory herself. "What now?" she asked, arms crossed tightly, voice edged with impatience. Arthur looked up slowly, his tone even but weary. "Water, please. Not cold. Just room temperature, if you have it." Kylie blinked, as if she'd never heard such a request in her life, then turned without a word and disappeared into the galley. Moments later, she returned and extended a plastic cup filled to the brim with ice, no water in sight. The ice rattled as she held it out, condensation already spilling over the rim. "Here," she said, her voice sharp and mocking. "You'll get used to it. Cold. Like everything else you'll find back here." Arthur didn't take the cup. He just looked at it, then at her, then gently turned his eyes back toward the floor. Kylie let out a short, exasperated huff, and dropped the cup on the tray next to the unopened snack bar. The ice clicked against the plastic, a hollow sound that echoed louder than her footsteps as she walked away. The cabin air grew still again, but it didn't stay quiet for long. A few passengers near the lavatory shifted in their seats, the smell of heated food wafting from first class, carried down the aisle by the circulation system. As one of the lavatory doors opened and released another gust of chemical odor, Kylie passed by once more. She paused near Arthur, narrowed her eyes, then wrinkled her nose. "Do you smell that?" she said loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. She sniffed again, then turned toward Derek, who had just exited the galley with a tray of drinks. "Smells like something's lingering." Derek didn't respond. He looked at Kylie, then quickly away, walking down the aisle without saying a word. But she wasn't done. Kylie reached into the side pocket of her apron and pulled out a small canister of aerosol spray. She gave it a good shake, then sprayed it in a wide arc over Arthur's head, the mist clouding the air with an artificial lavender scent so thick it clung to his coat and shirt like fog. "We need to keep things fresh," she said, her lips curling into something that almost passed for a smile. The woman 2 rows ahead turned around, clearly stunned. The businessman across from her leaned sideways, catching the last of the mist in his face. "Was that really necessary?" he muttered. Kylie ignored them both. She was still looking at Arthur, still waiting for some kind of reaction, something she could use to justify whatever came next. But Arthur just sat there, perfectly still, hands folded atop his cane, his eyes fixed forward, unwavering. The scent hung thick in the air, artificial and cloying, masking not odor, but dignity. A younger flight attendant named Grace appeared briefly at the end of the aisle. She took one look at the scene, the empty water cup, the untouched snack, the overwhelming smell of aerosol, and seemed to freeze. Her gaze met Arthur's, and for a flicker of a second, her expression softened into something dangerously close to empathy. But when Kylie turned, Grace vanished down the aisle like smoke. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Arthur didn't move. A child nearby began to cry. The bathroom door opened and closed again and again, and the space around him grew warmer, denser, more suffocating. His collar itched. His throat tightened. Still, he said nothing. Then came the final insult. As the crew began preparing for the dinner service up front, Kylie returned once more, this time without speaking. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't even pretend courtesy. She simply reached into the panel above him, grabbed a sealed pouch labeled miscellaneous, and dropped it into his lap. Inside was a napkin, a wet towelette, and a note that read, "Please freshen up if needed." Arthur stared at it for a long moment. The implication was clear. The note wasn't about hygiene. It was about hierarchy, a reminder of where she believed he belonged. Behind him, another passenger cleared his throat. Across the aisle, the teenager who had whispered earlier was now silent, staring wide-eyed at Kylie's retreating back. Even the ones who had laughed before had stopped. The heavy cloud of artificial lavender still lingered in the air as Kylie strutted back into the galley, her steps sharp and satisfied, her expression brighter than it had been all flight. She didn't look back at Arthur, not even a glance to see if he had finally broken beneath her layered humiliations. She didn't need to. In her mind, the job was done. Behind her, Arthur sat stone still, but ahead of her, she entered the one space where no passenger could see her true face. The galley was quiet except for the faint rattling of cups and the hiss of a coffee machine. Grace was there, eyes down, preparing drink trays with trembling fingers, and Derek leaned against the counter, silently organizing packets of sugar and stir sticks. Kylie exhaled dramatically as she dropped her service pad onto the counter and reached for a bottle of ginger ale. "God," she said, rolling her shoulders, "I swear dealing with that guy is like trying to clean up after a drunk raccoon." Grace paused, her hand hovering over a cup, but said nothing. Derek looked up, one brow raised, but Kylie kept going. "Honestly," she continued, voice low but cutting, "I should get hazard pay for this. First I had to pry him out of a seat he clearly didn't belong in. Then he starts making demands like he's some kind of king. Water? No ice? Please. This isn't a spa." She took a sip from the bottle and smirked. He's lucky I didn't dump a bag of peanuts in his lap and tell him to enjoy the in-flight cuisine. Derek shifted uncomfortably, clearly debating whether to speak. You think maybe? I mean, don't you think it was a bit much? Kylie didn't even look at him. Derek, don't be naive. That man boarded this flight with a first-class ticket. Yes, but that doesn't mean it was real. You and I both know people game the system all the time. Upgrades, buddy passes, favors from shady agents. I've seen it 100 times. Grace finally looked up, her voice soft but firm. But his boarding pass scanned. Twice. The seat was his. Kylie turned to her with a laugh that carried no warmth. Grace, sweetie, you're new, so let me explain how this works. There are rules on paper, and then there's the order we actually keep. First class is about experience, about profile, about who fits. You think anyone back there feels sorry for him? Please. She leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing. Passengers pay 10 grand a seat to avoid people like that. Her tone dropped to a whisper. You really think he was going to blend in with our platinum members? Look at him. He didn't even wear real leather. His shoes looked like they came from a thrift store. Grace flinched but didn't reply. Kylie turned back to Derek, who was staring at her now with an unreadable expression. You know what I told the guy in 1A, she said with a chuckle. I told him we were just clearing out the trash. And he laughed, said he'd never seen a flight handled so well. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, swiping through a few messages, then smiled. And now I get to serve that man duck confit and champagne while the old guy in the back smells like mothballs and floor cleaner. Justice served. Just then, the intercom crackled softly, and a voice came through, calm, measured, unmistakably firm. Kylie, can you come forward to the cockpit for a moment? It was the captain. She straightened immediately, brushing invisible lint from her uniform. Be right back, she said, stepping out of the galley with the confidence of someone certain of her authority. The cockpit door opened with a hiss and closed behind her, sealing her in with the captain and first officer. Inside, the hum of instruments blended with the low roar of altitude. Captain Harmon, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a reputation for no-nonsense leadership, looked up from the panel. Kylie, he said evenly, we've had a note passed up from a passenger in row 4. They're concerned about someone being displaced from first class. Kylie blinked, but quickly adopted a professional tone. Yes, Captain. That was resolved earlier. The passenger in question was seated incorrectly due to a system error. A system error? Harmon asked, raising a brow. That's what was recorded. Not officially, she admitted. But I made the call. The man in question, he seemed confused and honestly, he was making the other guests uncomfortable. Confused how? Harmon pressed. Kylie shrugged. He kept asking for things, didn't understand why his seat was reassigned, and kept talking about being treated fairly. Frankly, it became disruptive. We have policies for reallocation, and I exercise my discretion. Harmon studied her for a long moment, then said, was there any aggression? Any refusal to comply? Any threats? No, sir, Kylie said, maintaining her poise. Just persistent entitlement. He wouldn't stop insisting he belonged there. And what exactly did you tell the passengers in first class about it? He asked. Kylie hesitated, but only for a second. I said it was a miscommunication, that he likely misunderstood how premium boarding works. You didn't mention his race, did you? Harmon's voice was suddenly ice. Kylie's eyes widened slightly. Of course not, sir. I wouldn't. He nodded slowly. Because someone in row 1 told the purser that you referred to him as some old black guy who didn't understand the rules. Kylie's breath caught, but she masked it with a smile. That's a misinterpretation. Is it? The captain asked, his tone now colder than cabin air at 35,000 feet. Because that's not how it sounds on the flight recorder. Her smile faded. Excuse me. The forward galley mic picked up part of your conversation. And if the rest of that recording matches what we've just been told, we've got a serious issue. One that might not wait until we land. For the first time, Kylie said nothing. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Captain Harmon didn't blink. Return to service. We'll finish this discussion later. But choose your next move very, very carefully. Back in the cabin, tension rippled beneath the surface like pressure behind a dam. Kylie's return from the cockpit was notably quieter than usual, her movements less sharp, her smile more brittle. She avoided eye contact with passengers, especially those in first class, where murmurs had already begun to swirl into something louder, more suspicious. Several travelers had seen her escort Arthur out, had watched the so-called inspection, had caught the exaggerated reactions, the spraying of air freshener. And now they were talking. Word was spreading, not just in whispers, but in clicks. 2 rows from the back, where Arthur still sat motionless near the lavatory, a boy no older than 9 sat with his parents. His name was Theo. His mother was Vietnamese American, his father Korean American, and they had been quietly watching the events unfold, too stunned by what they'd witnessed to intervene directly. But Theo, with the innocence only a child could possess, had seen something different in Arthur. Not a disruption, not a mistake, but someone who looked tired and kind. Someone who reminded him of his grandfather back home. For the past half hour, he'd been quietly sketching in the corner of his coloring book with a black pencil. When he finished, he whispered to his mom, who hesitated at first, then finally nodded. Theo stood slowly, gripping the small piece of paper carefully in both hands. He walked past the rows with short, determined steps until he reached Arthur's seat. Arthur, startled, looked up and met the boy's eyes. "I made this for you," Theo said softly. Arthur took the paper gently, his eyes scanning the drawing. It was a simple but heartfelt image. A man with a cane stand 0069ing tall in front of a crowd. Rays of light drawn around his head like a hero from a comic book. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, it said, "Strong man." For a moment, the wall inside Arthur cracked. His lips trembled, and his fingers tightened slightly around the paper. But he didn't speak. He simply nodded once, grateful, wordless. Then Kylie appeared again. "What's going on here?" she snapped, her voice cutting across the cabin. Theo flinched. His mother stood halfway up from her seat, but froze. "He was just," Arthur began, but Kylie snatched the drawing from his hand before he could finish. She looked at it, scoffed, and without hesitation, tore it clean down the middle. "Cabin decorum needs to be maintained," she said sharply. "No unnecessary movements or exchanges during service. Return to your seat, now." Theo's eyes widened with shock. He turned and ran back to his parents. His mother clutched him tightly, whispering something in Vietnamese under her breath, her face pale with fury. Arthur, still staring at the torn halves of the picture now crumpled on the tray in front of him, felt something shift inside. Not rage, not sorrow, but the rising certainty that things were no longer in her control. Across the aisle, a woman named Leona West, a tech entrepreneur from Seattle, had seen everything, from the boy's quiet gesture to Kylie's response. She had been hesitant before, unsure whether to get involved. But that moment, ripping up a child's drawing in front of everyone, was the final straw. She pulled out her phone, tapped to start a live stream, and angled the camera discreetly toward the back of the cabin. Flight 2197. Witnessing what I believe is targeted harassment against an elderly black man who was removed from first class despite a confirmed ticket. She spoke in a low but clear voice. He's now seated by the lavatory. Just now a young boy gave him a drawing. Kylie, the flight attendant, tore it in half in front of him. She angled the phone slightly to catch Kylie, who was now standing with her back turned, talking to Derek again. By the time the counter crossed 2,000 viewers, Leona's phone buzzed with notifications. People tagging news accounts, journalists, watchdog groups. She didn't speak again, just let the image do the talking. Arthur sitting with his head bowed slightly, Theo's mother glaring at Kylie, and Derek standing by helplessly, clearly regretting his silence. At the front of the plane, a passenger leaned into the aisle and called out, "Hey, can someone explain what's happening back there? Why is that gentleman sitting near the toilets when he was supposed to be in first class?" Kylie turned, face tightening. "Please remain seated. We're handling it." But the murmurs were no longer whispers. The story had left the confines of row 27 and was now climbing altitude faster than the aircraft itself. Back in the cockpit, The first officer's comms lit up with a ping. He looked at the screen, frowned. "Captain, we're getting flagged mentions on social. Something viral. About this flight." The captain glanced over. "Send it to my console." In row 27, Arthur hadn't moved. He remained still, as if molded into the narrow seat, his cane resting across his knees, his hands calmly folded. The torn pieces of the boy's drawing still sat on the tray table in front of him, untouched since Kylie had shredded it. Though he had said nothing, everyone around him could feel the silent gravity radiating from his presence, the kind that only comes from someone who had weathered storms others couldn't name. Grace emerged from the galley again, her steps tentative as she carried a tray with a single napkin and an untouched cup of tea. Unlike Kylie, her presence didn't impose, it observed. She had watched silently as the chaos built, but something in her conscience had finally reached a breaking point. As she approached Arthur's seat, she leaned forward, placing the tea gently on his tray with a whisper too low for anyone else to hear. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, voice trembling. "I know who you are." Arthur's eyes met hers for the first time. Calm, steady, unreadable. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a small, matte black metal card. It was sleek, heavy-looking, with a single engraved logo, 3 silver wings crossing a stylized crown. Beneath it, in raised chrome lettering, were 5 words, Founder Langston Aviation Group. Grace's breath caught audibly. She stared at the card for a full second too long before catching herself and stepping back, the color draining from her face. "Sir, she started, but Arthur raised one hand gently, not in dismissal, but in grace. He placed the card flat on the tray, next to the torn drawing, and returned to silence. Grace turned quickly and made her way back up the aisle, her hands trembling slightly now. She disappeared behind the curtain to the front cabin, her heart pounding in her ears. Up in first class, Kylie was pouring a second glass of champagne for Mr. Simmons, the executive she had so graciously reseated in 1A. She smiled, laughed at one of his jokes, and straightened his napkin with performative precision. But her posture faltered when Grace emerged, eyes wide, and leaned in to whisper urgently in her ear. Kylie's face froze mid-smile. "What do you mean, you know who he is?" she hissed. Grace glanced toward the rear of the plane, then back at Kylie. "You need to see the card. It's real. I checked it against the partner registry in the crew manifest. He's not just a VIP, he owns the parent company." Kylie blinked, her hand still resting on a tray of petit fours, as the realization began to settle into her bones like ice water. "That's not possible," she muttered. "He was dressed like what?" Grace said quietly, her voice now harder. "Like someone who didn't matter." Kylie stepped back, her breath quickening. She suddenly felt the pressure of every word she'd said in the galley, every action taken without cause, every demeaning look, every justification she'd told herself. The joke about trash, the lavender spray, the torn drawing, the silent eyes of the cabin, all watching, all remembering. A few seats away, Leona's live stream was still running, now crossing 19,000 viewers. Comments were pouring in by the second. At Jet Watchdog, "If this man's who we think he is, someone's about to lose everything." At Justice Flight, "Just got confirmation. Langston Aviation Group co-owns 6 international carriers, including this one." At Veritas Media, "Cross-checking against the Board of Aviation. Arthur Langston, billionaire, philanthropist, retired aerospace engineer, CEO emeritus. This airline flies under his charter." Up in the cockpit, the captain's console flashed again. This time it wasn't a ping. It was a direct message from HQ. "Urgent. Passenger Arthur Langston confirmed onboard flight 2197. CEO level authority. Ensure immediate de-escalation. Report back post-landing." Captain Harmon turned to his first officer. "Get Kylie up here. Now." But he didn't need to. The cockpit door opened seconds later, and Kylie entered unprompted, her face pale, her movements jerky. She closed the door behind her, trying to keep her composure. "Sir," she began. "Sit," the captain said. She obeyed. The first officer slid a tablet across the console. On it was the live stream, paused on Arthur's face, with the card sitting on his tray. Below it, dozens of headlines from independent news outlets had already begun populating. Billionaire humiliated mid-flight. Langston treated like a criminal on airline he owns. Justice at 38,000 feet. Founder publicly abused by his own airline staff. Captain Harmon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You had one job, he said. Protect the dignity of everyone on board. You failed. Kylie tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. Not because she didn't have excuses, but because for the first time, they sounded hollow even in her own head. Passengers sat upright, silent now, every eye flicking from Arthur Langston to the crew, from the crew to their phones, from their phones back to him. No one spoke, not even the child who had drawn him as a hero. In row 27, Arthur reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat once more. This time, it wasn't the black metal card he retrieved. It was a sleek, dark phone, slimmer than most, with a custom engraved back and encrypted interface known only to executives of Langston Aviation Group. His thumb tapped the screen with methodical precision, inputting a 4-digit authorization code that glowed faintly. 7-9-3-1. The screen shifted. A button appeared. Executive Notify in-flight chain override. He tapped it once. No flourish, no sound, just a quiet command that rippled far louder than any voice ever could. 1 minute passed. Then 2. In the crew galley, Grace's tablet buzzed softly on the counter. She stepped toward it, confused, then froze. A red notification banner glowed at the top of the screen. Urgent. Executive Directive in-flight staff action required. Open immediately. Her hand trembled as she tapped the alert. The message expanded into a secured memo from the Office of Corporate Affairs. It read, Langston Aviation Holdings confirms the presence of founder and board chairman Mr. Arthur Langston aboard Flight 2197. All crew are instructed to comply with standard executive protocol. Immediate courtesy and repositioning to first-class accommodations are mandatory. Failure to comply will result in review by Corporate Governance and HR Disciplinary Board. This directive is not negotiable. The signature at the bottom bore the name of the CEO. Not just the airlines, but the entire holding group. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Kylie, who was still frozen near the cockpit door, pale as paper, her eyes scanning her own device, which now buzzed with the same alert. Derek entered the galley just then, his own tablet in hand, and said nothing as he showed them his screen. The same directive, same code, same name. Kylie's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Grace didn't wait. She turned and strode quickly toward the back of the plane, her steps brisk, filled with urgency and purpose. Derek followed. They moved past rows of silent passengers, who now watched them as if something historic was happening. Because it was. When they reached Arthur, Grace crouched slightly to meet his eye level, her voice soft, filled with reverence. Mr. Langston, she said, we received the directive. We're so sorry. We didn't know. We. Arthur raised one hand, quiet but commanding. You knew enough to be kind, he said. That's more than most. Grace nodded, eyes stinging. We'd like to move you now, sir. Back to first class. We've secured 1A for you. And there's a message waiting from the CEO. Would you like to take the call privately? Arthur didn't answer right away. He looked down at the pieces of the drawing still tucked in his hand. Then he glanced toward Theo, who was staring from his seat with wide, hopeful eyes. No, Arthur said at last. I'll walk. The entire plane watched as he stood, slower now from the stiffness of sitting so long, but tall, taller than he had seemed at the beginning of the flight. As he straightened his coat and grasped his cane, the cabin seemed to expand with every step he took. Not in distance, but in weight, in gravity, in presence. As he moved forward, passengers instinctively parted, many lowering their eyes in quiet apology, some murmuring soft sirs as he passed, others nodding with newfound respect. When he reached the curtain dividing the cabins, he paused and turned slightly. Kylie stood there, still frozen, eyes wide, her mouth moving, but no words coming. Arthur looked at her for a long moment, not angry, not smug, just steady. "You didn't fail because you didn't know who I was," he said, his voice low but firm. "You failed because you assumed you did." And with that, he walked past her, through the curtain, into the cabin that had once denied him. 1A had been reset. The seat was fresh, spotless, gleaming. A glass of water, no ice, waited on the tray. As Arthur sat, the screen in front of him lit up with an incoming secure video call. He tapped it once. The face of the CEO filled the screen, eyes wide with horror, voice rushed. "Sir, Mr. Langston, I'm so sorry. We had no idea." Arthur interrupted with a raised brow. "You should have built a culture where knowing wouldn't have been necessary." As the aircraft rolled to a smooth stop at Gate 14, a silence swept through the cabin more profound than anything experienced during the flight. It was the kind of silence that followed after truth had been revealed, when even the hum of the engines seemed to yield in reverence. Arthur remained seated in 1A, dignified and composed, one hand resting gently on the metal card he had placed on the tray table. The crew's internal channel had already been flooded with final directives from corporate headquarters, each more urgent than the last. Outside the window, a pair of black-suited men stood at the bottom of the jet bridge stairs, each wearing earpieces and scanning the area with the quiet alertness of private executive security. Their presence wasn't decorative, it was procedural. Inside the cockpit, Captain Harmon received one last instruction through the encrypted line from Langston Aviation Headquarters. "Before deplaning, escort Mr. Langston to the bridge. CEO waiting for formal statement. Security on standby for employee offboarding per Directive 27. The message was clear. This wasn't just damage control, it was reparation. Captain Harmon stepped out of the cockpit and approached Arthur with the quiet deference of a man who understood he was no longer in charge of the moment, but a participant in someone else's reckoning. "Mr. Langston," he said gently, "corporate has requested you join us in the flight deck for a direct conference with the board. We've also secured the perimeter for your privacy." Arthur stood, nodding once. He didn't ask for help. He didn't need it. He walked with the same slow power that had carried him to that final seat, except now every step echoed with justice catching up. As he entered the cockpit, the pilot's seat had been turned slightly for comfort. The screen above the panel flickered, and the face of Garrett Milner, the CEO of Langston Aviation Holdings, appeared in full resolution. Behind him, the setting sun filtered through a panoramic office window, casting long shadows over a boardroom filled with nervous executives. Garrett leaned forward, jaw tight, eyes solemn. "Mr. Langston," he began, voice strained with sincerity and shame, "on behalf of this company and every person employs, I offer my full, unconditional apology. What happened to you today is unacceptable. It violates not only policy but principle. I take full responsibility." Arthur tilted his head slightly, saying nothing. The silence demanded more. Garrett swallowed. "The staff involved have been identified. Immediate disciplinary action is underway. Ms. Kylie Warren will be relieved of duty upon disembarkation and processed through HR and compliance under Title IX provisions." He paused. "We've also initiated a full audit of internal staff conduct procedures and will be implementing mandatory retraining focused on implicit bias, ethics, and service culture across all divisions. You have my word, this will not be ignored." Arthur leaned forward, folding his hands. "Your apology is noted," he said, "but apologies don't fix culture. Action does. I built this airline to give people the dignity they are often denied elsewhere, not to see them stripped of it by uniforms that forget their purpose." Garrett nodded slowly. "Understood, sir. You'll have everything you need, every record, every file, every name. And when you're ready, we're prepared to issue a public statement in line with your discretion." Arthur ended the call with a calm press of the screen. As he exited the cockpit and returned to the cabin, the door to the jet bridge had been opened. Passengers had been instructed to remain seated. Security now stood inside the aircraft, waiting, stone-faced and professional. Kylie stood near the service station, her uniform slightly wrinkled, her hair no longer perfectly tight, her lips parted as if she still didn't believe what was happening. Grace and Derek stood behind her, neither gloating nor smirking, just watching, witnesses to consequence. One of the security agents stepped forward. "Ms. Warren," he said, "you are no longer authorized to continue duties on this aircraft. You'll exit with us now. A representative from the compliance board will meet you at the gate." Kylie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The passengers, silent all this time, watched as she was gently but firmly escorted toward the exit. A few whispered. Others filmed. One woman from first class muttered, "Good," under her breath. As Kylie passed Arthur, she tried to meet his eyes, perhaps looking for pity or forgiveness or a final word to hang on. But Arthur didn't flinch. He looked straight ahead, not with cruelty, but with clarity, because justice, when it arrives, doesn't always need to speak. Moments later, the rest of the passengers were permitted to disembark. But as they filed past many paused. Some murmured apologies. Others offered handshakes. A young woman pressed a handwritten note into Arthur's hand before slipping away. The boy Theo walked past with his mother, who gently said, he redrew it. She handed Arthur a new version of a sketch, the hero with the cane, now standing stronger, the words beneath bolder than before, "We see you." Arthur held it like something sacred. As he rose to leave, Grace met him at the exit door. "Thank you, sir," she said, "for not letting this stay hidden." Arthur gave her a small nod. "Truth always finds its way to the surface," he replied. Outside, camera flashes began to flicker at the gate's edge. Reporters were already assembling. Statements were being prepared. Inside the terminal, monitors across the lounge began flashing breaking news. Founder of Langston Aviation humiliated by his own airline. CEO issues public apology. Crew terminated. The footage had already reached every major news outlet before Arthur Bradford's polished shoes stepped onto the terminal floor. Though security cleared a path through the press, the weight of the crowd wasn't hostile. It was reverent. Cameras clicked in rapid rhythm. Microphones stretched over one another. Journalists shouting questions that blurred into white noise. But Elijah Arthur Bradford, moved through them like the eye of a storm, untouched, calm, unshaken. His presence alone was enough to command silence once he paused in front of the designated podium near Gate 14, now flanked by members of the airline's legal and communications teams. Behind him, digital displays no longer showed flight schedules. They now bore the company's logo and a simple phrase in stark white letters against black: "We apologize. We take responsibility." Across the country, thousands watched the live feed as it cut to Elijah standing before the podium, dressed not in power or performance, but in truth. No prepared statement, no teleprompter, just him, a man who had been underestimated from the moment he boarded the flight, now standing taller than any title could define. He scanned the crowd, some reporters, some employees, some everyday passengers who had gathered after seeing the story go viral. And then he spoke, voice steady, words sharp with grace. "I didn't expect to become a headline this week," he began. "I didn't plan for my return to end up on every screen in this terminal. And I didn't want to use my name to command respect. I wanted my presence to be treated with the same dignity we promise every passenger who steps onto our planes." He paused, letting the silence expand. But the events of this flight proved something deeper, something harder to accept. It's not just about me. It's about every person who gets dismissed because they don't fit someone else's idea of importance. It's about the mother spoken over, the child ignored, the old man told to move. And yes, it's about race, about assumptions, about bias dressed up as procedure. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and some heads lowered in recognition. Elijah continued, "I've spent my life building systems that lift people, pilots from single-parent homes, engineers who learned from scrap metal, flight crews who rose from nothing but heart. But all it takes is one act of unchecked arrogance to remind us that a uniform can shield cruelty, and silence can enable it." He looked directly into the camera now, as if speaking to those who had watched in outrage, those who had stayed silent, and those who saw themselves in him. I don't need respect for my rank. I ask only for respect for my humanity. That should be the standard. That must be the rule. The room erupted in quiet applause, not forced, not coordinated, but real. And as the camera zoomed in, the press release from Langston Aviation Holdings went live across all platforms. The statement was clear and uncompromising. We apologize to Mr. Elijah Bradford, our founder and chairman, for the unjust treatment he endured aboard Flight 2197. Effective immediately, MS. Kylie Warren has been permanently removed from duty and placed on industry-wide no-hire status under regulatory advisement. Our internal protocols have failed. We will rebuild them. News outlets ran back-to-back segments of the livestream. On social media, hashtags trended across platforms. Hashtag Elijah Bradford, hashtag Flight 2197, hashtag Dignity in the Sky. Public figures began issuing their own statements. Former pilots, civil rights advocates, even celebrities began sharing personal stories of similar moments, microaggressions, humiliations, silent acceptance. But today, silence had been broken. Back at the airline's headquarters, a mandatory company-wide Reformation Summit was called into session within 48 hours. Bias response training was rewritten, passenger grievance policies were restructured, and employee performance systems were overhauled with direct oversight from Elijah's personal executive team. No more unchecked discretion. No more hidden humiliation behind policy. Every training video would now open with one sentence: dignity isn't optional. As for Kylie, her termination was swift, but it wasn't the end of her reckoning. Her name appeared on national broadcasts as part of the accountability effort. Her conduct had violated not only corporate standards, but national anti-discrimination laws. She was summoned to an ethics review panel, and future employment in any hospitality or aviation sector became virtually impossible. She tried to issue her own apology, but the words rang hollow without ownership of what had been done. Meanwhile, Elijah declined every talk show offer, every magazine interview, every speaking engagement. He didn't want fame. He never had. He returned to his hometown instead, where local students, mostly kids of color, waited outside his childhood library holding hand-painted signs that read, "Thank you for standing tall." He donated the medal card to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, not as a token of wealth, but as a symbol of what happens when quiet strength refuses to bow to public dismissal. On the anniversary of the incident, the airline hosted a flight in his honor, Flight 1A, piloted by a young black woman who had been inspired by his story. Elijah didn't attend the ceremony. He was too busy visiting local aviation schools, sitting quietly in classrooms, reminding students that the most powerful people are often the ones others don't notice, until they have no choice. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another powerful moment like this. What would you have done if you were on that flight? Do you think the crew should have been punished more severely? And how do you feel about Arthur's response? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.